Liam Carter was 29 years old, a quiet life in the small town of Geronimo in western Kansas. As the keeper of an old farm inherited from his grandparents, he spent his mornings tending to the estate and his evenings in the solitude of the vast plain, where the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the occasional crackle of wood. Liam has always been fascinated by the stories that circulated about the region, many of which involve legends of creatures that disguise themselves in darkness, such as the legendary Skinwalkers, entities that can supposedly take the form of animals or even humans to camouflage their true intentions. These stories, told from generation to generation by locals, have created an atmosphere of mystery and care around every corner of the property. The setting where Liam lived was as old as the land itself. A rustic-looking farm with a large, aged, wooden house surrounded by quiet wheat fields and a pine forest that marked the border of the horizon. At night, the sky opened up completely, invisible to the urban lights, offering a spectacle of intense stars and an almost palpable darkness. The nearby forest, known to locals as the Shadow, had a quiet reputation. Reports of missing animals, inexplicable screams, and people who avoided crossing its boundaries after dark became common stories among the elders. On that particular night, Liam was alone at home, deep in reading old family records about local legends, wanting to better understand the stories he had heard since he was a child. The strong wind blowing outside seemed charged with a strange energy, heavier than usual. As he looked through the huge windows of the living room, he noticed a change in the external environment. The trees, which usually swayed gently, were still, as if they were trapped in an unsettling immobility. An almost absolute silence took over the field, leaking a feeling that something unexpected was approaching. Suddenly, Liam heard a strange noise coming from the direction of the forest, a sound of heavy footsteps, like someone or something, walking with strength and intent. His eyes widened, his heart began to race as his ears caught the sound of branches being broken under unknown weight. His fingers trembled as he clutched an old machete he kept next to his chair. It was as if the very nature around him began to convulse, begging for attention, as an unseen presence seemed to watch closely, hidden in the dim light. She increased the volume of her breathing, trying to understand what that could mean. But the only answer was a wave of fear that took over her body, realizing that the threat, silent and sinister, had begun to insinuate itself into her life in an irreversible way. After that strange noise in the woods, Liam tried to calm his mind, convincing himself that it was just the wind or some nocturnal animal moving among the trees. However, the lingering feeling that something different was happening began to slowly creep into his thoughts. With each passing minute, he found himself more alert, as if his intuition was screaming for attention. His eyes scanned the dark beyond, the windows, looking for any sign of movement, but all remained silent, almost still. Still, a growing discomfort insisted on accompanying him, like an invisible presence that touched his spirit with a sense that he was not alone that night. Eager to find a rational explanation, Liam tried to rationalize the signs he had noticed. Perhaps it was just his imagination, fueled by the stories that had haunted the region for decades, or the effect of a storm that had passed through the area a few hours earlier, leaving a charged and strange atmosphere. He slowly got up from the couch, walking among the shadows of the room, trying not to look vulnerable. In the midst of the darkness, his footsteps echoed in silence, a sense of isolation that seemed to amplify every sound, even the subtlest. As he passed through the larger window, he noticed that the trees that had once swayed gently were now completely still, their silhouettes forming almost human figures in the dim light, as if frozen by an unknown force. Suddenly, Liam noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere, a slight alteration in the air, as if nature itself were breathing more slowly, charged with a heavy energy that could almost be touched. The objects around him appeared darker. The moonlight, once bright, seemed distorted and threatening. A hazy sense that something had shifted beyond rational comprehension began to grow within him. His senses were heightened, and every noise outside seemed amplified, like a whisper of a quiet presence. It was difficult to distinguish what was real from what could just be the result of his anxiety, but at the same time, he was convinced that what was out there was not human. Liam tried to focus on the belief that it could all be an illusion, something his mind wove in the darkness, but the signs piled up. A shadow that seemed to move against his will, a sense that his eyes were fixed in his direction, even though he couldn't see who or what it was. When he looked again at the forest, he noticed a line of trees that seemed to be slowly writhing, as if their forms were disguising or transforming. The way the distorted shadows stretched on the outside wall of the house only fueled his doubt. It could be a manifestation of something supernatural that had begun that night, an ancient and forgotten force, which was perhaps related to the legends that everyone avoided mentioning. For Liam, that restlessness was not just a fear of the unknown, but a suspicion that there was something much closer and more dangerous than he could comprehend, something that tried to hide in the darkness, ready to reveal its true face when he least expected it. And as much as he tried to maintain rationality, he felt that this moment marked the beginning of a truth that would change his perception of the world forever. Liam felt more and more uneasy, as if the invisible presence around him was slowly becoming tangible. His heart beat wildly, an adrenaline rush he'd never experienced before taking over every fiber of his body. Anxiety felt like a tight lump in her throat, making it difficult to even breathe. Every little sound, every distant noise in the woods seemed like ominous whispers that grew in intensity, as if the environment itself was conspiring against him. He tried to convince himself that everything was an illusion, a manifestation of his anxiety or fear fueled by the stories he had heard since he was a boy. But his mind could no longer distinguish the real from the imagined. His eyes, which had previously sought rationality, now fixed on the darkness beyond the windows, looking for any movement, any sign that could explain it all. Without success, only a growing sense of powerlessness set in. Liam felt a quiet force, a threat that lurked in the dim light, watching him patiently, waiting for the right moment to act. The shadows of the trees seemed to stretch, to writhe, as if breathing an evil essence. The feeling of being on the edge of something indescribable took over his soul, plunging him into an almost paralyzing anxiety. Inside, a battle was raging. Keep calm or give in to panic. He wondered if it was the effect of his imagination, or if in fact something dark, ancient and nameless was there, hovering on his border, testing his courage. Creatures he had only heard of in old man stories, which he had always thought were legends, seemed to be now within range of his peripheral vision, moving in the shadow so that his eyes could barely catch it. A chill ran down his spine as he realized that the forest seemed to close, as if it was sucking all the light and hope around it. His breathing quickened, and he felt a cold sweat run down his back. The feeling that something threatened him, something that could come out of the shadows at any moment, increased with each moment, leaving him on the verge of despair. His mind was filled with unanswered questions. Why nothing else happened, why nothing was clearly shown, but he was sure that this night marked a definitive change. A deep sense of vulnerability seeped into his psyche, as if he was being surrounded by forces he could not understand or control. The more he tried to maintain lucidity, the stronger that feeling became, that they heard his footsteps, that his inner words were not secret, that the sinister presence around him could destroy him without warning. Liam felt trapped in a web of fear, unable to escape, powerless in the face of an evil that seemed to feed on his own anxiety. The darkness, now heavy and oppressive, seemed to be absorbing his hope, leaving only one certainty. He would never look at the night the same. Way again. The abyss was out there, in boundless shadow, and he knew with a razor-like certainty that it would never leave him alone again. Liam felt that the presence around him became more and more conscious, as if the creatures or forces that haunted him were not only hiding in the shadows, but learning to adapt to his fear. His breathing became more difficult, and the feeling that something had changed in the air intensified with each moment. He noticed small things. The noises that had previously seemed indistinct now had a pattern, almost like a response. A rustle. Beyond the windows, an almost inaudible whisper that seemed to come from the dark, like a silent conversation between unseen entities. These forces seemed to be examining your every move, adjusting intelligently and silently, as if discovering your vulnerabilities in the face of your distraction or fear phase. Liam tried to convince himself that they were just the effects of his imagination, an illusion created by the fear that gripped him. But something about the way the shadows moved, or the sounds that became more coordinated, reinforced the idea that he was no longer dealing with a random force, but with something that was aware of its presence. The creatures seemed to be adapting to their attempts to understand or flee from them, evolving into their silent threat. The night seemed to have become an invisible battlefield where he had to fight a threat that gradually became more real. A strange whisper echoed in the house as a response to some move Liam made, though he couldn't determine where it came from. This presence seemed to learn to manipulate the environment around it, modulating the sounds and shadows to create a sense of growing dread. The objects inside the house also seemed to react strangely. A chair he left in the room moved slowly, as if pulled by an imperceptible force or having a consciousness of its own. Liam fixed his gaze on the basement door, hoping that it was just an illusion. But when he noticed an elongated shadow passing through the corridor, the suspicion was consolidated. The threat not only existed, but multiplied, adjusted, and infiltrated his perception of reality, feeding the feeling that he had no escape. Doubt turned to silent certainty that this, or they, were literally becoming part of the space he called home. The forces that haunted him seemed to become more and more sophisticated in their adaptation, building an invisible trap. Liam felt their presence molding itself to his fear, as if every moment of frustration and helplessness fueled the threat even more. He still didn't have a clear vision of what he was facing, but his instinct told him that the worst was yet to come. It fed on silence and the unknown, growing silently in the darkness as he remained caught in a web of mystery and fear, unable to comprehend how far the threat was evolving. The feeling of being surrounded by forces that had learned to camouflage and adapt added to their anguish, making it clear that these supernatural beings or forces were far more intelligent and dangerously silent than any known description. Liam felt his world fragment by the moment. That night, everything around him seemed to be bending and distorting, as if reality itself was unraveling before his eyes. The shadows that once seemed simple plays of light and dark now took on indecipherable, almost vivid forms that moved with frightening freedom. His thoughts scrambled. He doubted what he saw and heard, as if the boundary between the real and the imagined was slowly dissolving. With each whisper, he wondered if it was a hallucination produced by extreme fear or some supernatural force trying to manipulate his mind. The environment around him seemed to be transforming, the house and the forest outside it starting to occupy spaces that seemed to be reconfigured, changing shape and place. The wall behind him, for example, seemed to stretch and shrink like crazy, as if everything was made of a malleable, living material. The objects in the room had an uncertain consistency. The once solid wooden chair seemed to melt in his hands, his legs dissolving into a dark mist. Liam tried to look at his own reflection in the window, but his image seemed to fragment into multiple versions, each with a different expression, as if he were seeing several versions of himself, all frightened, all lost. The nearby forest, which had once had motionless trees and restless silhouettes, now writhed continuously, as if alive and frightened, replicating its emotions and becoming an extension of its own madness. A moment ago he wondered if all this was the result of a state of extreme exhaustion, or if he was being the target of an intelligent manipulation of forces beyond human comprehension. His senses were at war. A part of him insisted that everything was just an illusion, a manifestation of his fear and anxiety. Another, sharper, recognized signs that something supernatural really surrounded him. The walls seemed to breathe. The floor vibrates under your feet, and even the air around you seems to be impregnated with an energy that you can't define. Liam felt his understanding of reality being lost, as if he were walking through a nightmare dream, where nothing is as it seems. Each moment was more disconcerting than the last, his perceptions blending into a flurry of confusing images. The shadow in the window that appeared to be a person, but disappeared as soon as he blinked, or the absolute silence at certain moments, interrupted by a distant laugh that had no origin. His eyes, once confident, now betrayed him, threatening to see what didn't exist, hearing what wasn't real. The feeling of being completely lost grew, and Liam had the feeling that his own mind was becoming a battlefield where unseen forces fought against him. The thin line between what was true and what was fantasy blurred, leaving him vulnerable in the face of a fragmented and distorted perception. He no longer knew what was real, what was the product of his imagination, or if it was all part of a cursed manipulation, a secondary reality created by entities that wished not only to observe him, but to completely dominate him in the darkness. Liam knew he couldn't run away from the fear that consumed him. The attempt to rationalize everything had been futile. He felt that his perception of reality was crumbling, and that invisible nightmare became more and more present, more threatening. The darkness around him seemed to thicken, forming an evil aura that surrounded him like a prison with no way out. His eyes desperately searched for a way out, any sign that it was all just an illusion. But all the images only reinforced the feeling that an ancient, intelligent, and wicked force was approaching him. The entity, or whatever it was, had begun to manifest itself more aggressively, its movements bolder, its presences more palpable. Liam felt an invisible force pull him to the center of the room, as if he was being drawn by an otherworldly gravity. His breathing accelerated, his heart beat uncontrollably, and an intense cold ran through his back. To his surprise, his mind now found itself confronted with a choice: resist or surrender to complete terror. With a final force, Liam grabbed the machete at his side, trembling but determined to face whatever was there. His eyes fixed on the shadow that seemed to emerge from the darkest corner of the room, acquiring a blurred form, almost like a human figure, but of indescribable ugliness. The creature, or force, seemed to become aware of its presence, and for an instant the tension reached its peak. The whole room seemed to vibrate with chaotic energy, as if the universe itself was on the verge of collapse. Liam screamed, a cry of courage or despair, and attacked with the machete, the blades reflecting a flickering light against the shadow. The impact seemed to have no effect, as if the entity was composed of another matter, immune to human weapons. But the act was enough to generate an unexpected reaction. The shadow quickly receded, like a wounded animal, and a deep scream, almost a scream of pain, echoed through the room. In that moment, Liam felt an internal battle within him, a conflict between his instinct to flee, to give in to fear, and his will to resist, to fight against that which threatened to destroy his mind. The confrontation turned into a game of survival, where his tumultuous emotions almost paralyzed him, but also fueled a latent strength of courage. His vision began to fork. On one side, the direct threat, a force that seemed to want to suck his soul. On the other, his own determination not to be defeated. He wanted to scream, asked for some form of help, but only a desperate whisper came out. His eyes met the void, the shadow regrouping, ready to strike again. In that moment, Liam realized that his only chance was to confront everything he had. His will, his courage, and his hope that this, as incomprehensible as it was, could be defeated. With a shout of resistance, he charged forward, brandishing his machete in a desperate attempt to cut through that invisible force. The confrontation was brutal, chaotic, an instant in which everything seemed to tip towards chaos, and the thin line between life and death seemed to close quickly around him. It was a struggle of soul and matter, of mind and shadow, in which Liam had to decide whether to succumb or fight to the end. The climax would not only determine his survival, but also the truth that the terror he faced had a consciousness, an intelligence that would continue his hunt, even after his apparent victory or defeat. Liam stood still for a moment after the endless confrontation, his heavy breathing filling the heavy silence of the house. The shadow that once threatened consumed itself in a kind of dark mist, slowly fading as a sense of relief mixed with confusion invaded him. His thoughts were clouded, trying to understand if the victory had any real meaning, or if it had all been just an illusion fueled by fear. He still felt the weight of that invisible presence, like a long shadow that remained there, even when the danger seemed to have passed. The room, which hours before had looked like an arena of terror, now felt like a quiet and oppressive space. Liam sat up slowly, his body shaking, his muscles weighed by the mental and physical effort he had just made. He began to reflect on the choices he made, the decision to face it, not to run away, even if he had the chance to hide or to flee to safety. At that moment, the weight of everything she witnessed seemed heavier than ever. The agitation of his mind calmed down, giving way to an unsettling uncertainty. Had this really been a confrontation, or had he just created an illusion at the height of fear? Perhaps it was all just a manifestation of his own anxiety, a projection of an environment loaded with old stories. Perhaps even a hallucination generated by extreme fatigue and fertile imagination. But there is a lingering sense that something has changed in your perception of the world. The presence of that unknown evil did not disappear completely. It only hid itself in the shadows. Liam looked around, watching the shadows that stretched out in the house, his mind becoming a mixture of doubt and hope that it was all just a fantasy. But doubt swirled, almost like a beast waiting to jump again. He questioned whether he had truly defeated it, or had only managed to retreat temporarily, while the real threat remained hidden in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to reappear. The night remained quiet, but his internal rhythm remained fast. His mind was thinking about the stories he had heard, the legends of Skinwalkers, and the feeling that some ancient, indomitable force still dwelt in the shadows around him, waiting for the next moment of vulnerability. The house now seemed to be experiencing a kind of tense silence, a brief pause before everything went back out of control. Liam felt a chill down his spine as he realized that his fight was not over, that there was still no certainty that those forces were truly defeated. His thoughts mingled with the silence of the night, creating an atmosphere of frustrated hope, of uncertainty. Even with the fear that still insisted on tormenting him, he knew that his survival depended on staying calm and not giving in to the feeling of helplessness. The brief peace of that night seemed as fragile as a spider's web, about to be destroyed. With the slightest wisp of wind, and as he leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding, Liam realized that the battle, though momentarily won, still had no definitive end. The real question remained in the air. Could that, or something like it, return at any moment in the darkness of the night, with even more force, more cunning, and more thirsty for his soul? Uncertainty was the only certainty there. The fear of that night would never go away completely. Liam stood there in the dim light of the room, his mind still haunted by recent events. Although he felt that he had escaped direct confrontation with what seemed to be a supernatural force, a doubt persisted deep within his being. To what extent had he really understood what he faced? The feeling that there were still unanswered questions dissatisfied his conscience. He realized that that night had revealed only a fraction of what was really hiding in the darkness around his home. The whispers and shadows he had seen, the movements he seemed to learn and adapt to, all indicated that this was not a simple entity or a passing illusion. There were deep secrets, stories buried for generations that had not yet been fully discovered. Liam began to rummage through his family's old records, seeking links to local legends, to the stories his grandparents used to tell about the farm's surroundings. And in doing so, he discovered ancient references to transforming entities, procreating in the silence of the night, and to forgotten rituals that could be related to the forces that pursued him. But the deeper he delved into this dark past, the more he realized that certain information was protected by a veil of secrecy, perhaps to prevent anyone from discovering what really existed in the darkness. His eyes scanned drawings, ancient texts, and fragmentary accounts that pointed to an ancient power, a force that surpassed human comprehension. This skinwalker-like force, or entity, seemed to be linked to the energy lines of the region, feeding on fear, despair, and silence itself. Liam was left with the feeling that, although he had managed to protect himself temporarily, he had done nothing more than postpone an inevitable revelation. There was still more to learn, more secrets hidden under the ancient roots of the trees, under the rocks of the earth, and within the very history of their lineage. One thing was clear: what he faced was not a mere legend nor a passing threat. It was an ancient secret, a force that had long wished to return to the world of human beings, feeding on their fear and ignorance. And at the same time, Liam began to interpret the deeper signs, realizing that this entity or force might be toying with him, begging for a connection, an acknowledgement that would perhaps envelop him further in the darkness. The more he tried to unravel the mystery, the more he found himself at the tip of an iceberg of dark secrets, a web of secrets that stretched across the history of his region and beyond. What he had discovered so far was only a spark, a small glimpse of a bottomless abyss. The environment itself seemed to conspire to keep the secrets hidden, as if the night itself kept its most hidden truths away from the light. And as Liam felt more and more drawn to the mystery, an unsettling feeling grew. What he was trying to understand might not be destined to be revealed easily. Perhaps behind the curtain of shadows, there was a truth that would change everything, a truth that once discovered could no longer be forgotten. And so the story ends, with Liam staring blankly into the darkness that surrounded him, aware that the true mystery is still waiting to be unraveled, hidden in the deepest folds of the endless night. Samuel Mitchell was 34 years old and worked as an investigator of unsolved crimes in the small town of Hollow Creek, located in the vast territories of Oregon. His routine was marked by silent nights. He often spent hours reviewing old cases, trying to find clues in the details that others disregarded. But in this remote region, surrounded by dense forests and ancient mountains, there was something darker than its usual cases, legends that circulated among the residents. Stories of creatures that disguised themselves in darkness, of beings that hid on the boundaries between the real and the supernatural. Samuel, skeptical by nature, always considered them only myths until that night. His investigation led him to an old abandoned cabin in the heart of the forest, a place the inhabitants had avoided for decades. They said that the place was cursed, that anyone who ventured there could disappear without a trace. The cabin was on the edge of a black lake, mirroring the full moon covered by heavy clouds, creating an atmosphere charged with evil. Samuel had received an anonymous tip that something strange was happening in that place, a pattern of unexplained disappearances and reports of terrifying sounds. As he approached, a sense of unease grew within him, like a silent warning. The surrounding trees seemed to whisper, their branches swaying with an almost unnatural force, as if they were alive, watching his every move. When he arrived at the cabin, the first thing he noticed was the absolute silence. No sound of animals or wind, just the heavy aura of something that waited in silence. Samuel surveyed the place with flashlights, his mind trying to rationalize. Perhaps it was just the effect of isolation or the fear fueled by the reports. But as he turned a corner, he saw signs of something strange. Footprints in the muddy ground that looked like no ordinary animal. They were human but distorted, with designs that suggested irregular movement, almost as if the person who had made them was dragging or staggering through the mud. A chill ran down his spine as a sense that something invisible was watching him intensified. Suddenly, a shadow passed quickly before his vision, disappearing into the dark. Samuel tried to ignore it, but he felt his heart racing even more, his intuition telling him that he had discovered something beyond any rational explanation. A silent threat which began to creep into the night, threatening to cross his path from something far worse than any legend. From that moment on, he knew that the mystery of the cabin was just the tip of the iceberg. Something old, something that waited in the dim light, slowly began to reveal itself to those who had the courage to look far beyond what their eyes allowed. The night, with its ominous silence, now seemed to be filled with secrets about to be unraveled, secrets that could change your perception of the world forever. Samuel felt that the atmosphere around him was slowly changing, a sense that what he thought was only a legend or an illusion was beginning to manifest itself concretely before his eyes. Every step he took in the abandoned hut seemed amplified by the oppressive silence that dominated the forest. The branches creaked as if whispering ancient secrets, and the mist that enveloped the place began to close in opaque circles, making it difficult to see. When he examined the footprints on the ground, a doubt began to arise. They were not just marks of a large animal, but they had an irregularity. The footprints seemed distorted, as if they were those of someone who staggered or tried to crawl, but the fantasy of an unconventional animal persisted in his mind, invisible to untrained eyes. Something else was there, hidden in the dim light, a force that apparently adapted to its surroundings, as if it were studying its movements. His breath grew shorter, and an icy sweat slipped down his forehead. He tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just a play of light, or an effect of his emotions or extreme tiredness. Maybe it was just the fear coming from loneliness, the imagination of someone who had spent hours alone in the forest. But even so, he couldn't ignore the feeling that someone or something was watching him. His eyes scanned the shadows, trying to catch any strange details that might indicate a presence. A passing shadow crossed his field of vision, and for a moment he thought he saw a hunched figure, almost like a human silhouette, in the direction of the dark pond. His heart pounded against his chest, and he held the flashlight tightly, trying to maintain control. His mind struggled between reason and a visceral intuition that this was not just a simple entity of legend. It was something intelligent, something that seemed to adapt to fear, like a force that knows its weaknesses and silently exploits them. The noises in the forest increased in intensity, footsteps that seemed to move toward him even though there was nothing visible. The wind that was once breeze now became a cold whisper, charged with a silence that seemed posterior to a distant scream, even though there was no other soul around. A sense of growing unease gripped his body, and he wondered if it all, the footprints, the whispers, the shadow that seemed to hide in the darkness, were mere illusions or concrete signs of something much older and more dangerous studying his movements. He tried to stay calm, but his instinct clearly said, "This is approaching." The tension was reaching its peak when suddenly she felt a stronger presence, almost like a weight in her mind, which seemed to whisper that all of this was just the beginning of something that would change her understanding of what really exists in the darkness. The night became a web of mystery, illusion, and danger, and Samuel was sure that he still had to discover what was hidden beyond the invisible veil that covers the forest and the hut. And even though he felt the danger, a part of him remained, curious, wanting to unravel the secret that this mysterious night held for him. Samuel felt fear growing destructively within him, like a shadow that spread throughout his body, suffocating his reason. Every new shadow that shifted in his visions, every strange sound that penetrated the absolute silence of the forest, seemed to steal his confidence and turn his doubts into irrational fear. His heart raced wildly, as if an invisible force tried to crush his chest, and his breathing was choppy, making it difficult to concentrate. What once seemed like a simple doubt, a passing shadow, a whisper of the wind, now became a concrete threat, a presence that approaches, silent, but increasingly intense. The anguish of not understanding what was happening made his mind fill with horrors he couldn't name. She felt completely vulnerable, unable to escape that suffocating feeling of impending danger. Each moment seemed to lengthen, enriching his fear with details that he tried to ignore, but that insisted on haunting his mind. His thoughts were scrambled in a desperate attempt to rationalize. Perhaps it was just his nervousness, the effect of a frightening environment, or hypnosis by loneliness. But as time went by, he realized that it had a force of its own. The sounds that had been scarce, light footsteps, distant whispers, the quiet creaking of trees, began to intensify, as if a spectral force were testing its limits, exaggerating every noise. A sense of repression invaded him, as if his escape options were slowly closing in without warning. Fear took over his emotions, sorrowful and almost paralyzing, as a growing anxiety settled in his chest. A kind of anxiety that made him unable to think clearly, as if all his logic were slipping away. Samuel was sure that something was wrong, that a force knows he is there and wants him to notice, but he had no idea what it was or what his intention was. A deeper unease began to dominate his thoughts. Maybe he had invaded forbidden territory, or maybe it was a manifestation of something otherworldly that he had never had to face before. Fear, once diffuse, now seemed like a presence that seeped into his soul, creeping into his confidence, eroding any hope of escape. He felt more helpless, like a small boat being carried away by a current that was too powerful. His wrists trembled, adrenaline rushed through his veins, and his vision seemed to blur with a mixture of panic and frustration. The feeling that he was being hunted, that something of him was feeding on in the darkness, became almost palpable. Even without understanding exactly what threatened him, he knew that it was playing with his emotions, that his vulnerability was the greatest invitation to something much worse. And as the night lingered, an unseen threat seemed to draw ever closer, enveloping him in a web of fear, anxiety, and helplessness. Anxiety wouldn't let him sleep, his thoughts mingling with the sounds of the forest and the shadow that seemed to ripple in the darkness itself. Samuel felt that his heart was going to burst with fear, and the only thing that was certain was that he would never look at the night in the same way again. For in the silence of the darkness, something sinister really lurked, watching, threatening, waiting for the moment to make his next move. Samuel felt that the invisible presence around him was no longer a mere shadow or passing illusion, but something that silently adapted to his attempts at understanding. With each minute, the threat seemed to strengthen, as if it was watching their actions and adjusting their posture to become more merciless. The noises in the forest became more coordinated as a conscious response of the one who was chasing him. A series of indistinct whispers began to echo in the distance, blending in with the wind, but carrying an intention that went beyond the natural. His senses became sharp, picking up details that had previously gone unnoticed, such as the small shadows that stretched and retracted, like beings hiding in the dim light. The feeling that something smarter than himself had become part of that environment weighed on his psychology, leaving him with the certainty that that force not only perceived him, but also molded itself to his fear, deepening his vulnerability. Samuel noticed that the trees themselves seemed to react to the presence, their silhouettes deforming, curving as if writhing in a silent dance. He realized that the footprints he had found before, although they looked strange, were now in different places, almost as if there had been an alteration in the natural order of things. Something disguised itself as a creature or force that looks through the curtain of reality, and this manipulation only increased its sense of danger. Distant, almost inaudible voices seemed to whisper incomprehensible words, which even without being understood, carried an intention of intimidation. Every sound, every move, felt like a tweak to the strategy of the one who hunted him, reinforcing the feeling that he no longer had control. Samuel began to doubt his own senses, while a sense that the threat had an intelligence of its own settled in his mind. What he once thought was a vague and frightening force gradually became a presence that adapted to his actions, creating a tense and frightening connection. His anxiety increased when he realized that this was not a random manifestation, but an entity that in some way studied his reactions, and whose threat became more and more real and palpable. His mind struggled to understand this silent mutation, but the fear screamed louder. It was there, and his ability to control the situation was completely gone. The forms in the darkness seemed to alter, taking on aspects he couldn't identify, as if they were reinventing themselves to remain hidden, while an evil presence slowly approached, leaving a trail of denser and denser mystery. Samuel then realized that what threatened him was not a mere creature, but a force that adapted, that camouflaged itself, that evolved in the shadows, a threat that, no matter how hard he tried to flee, seemed to be always one step ahead of him, hidden in the darkness itself. And the more he tried to understand, the deeper he sank into that elusive mystery, unable to escape the clutches of a threat that grew more intelligent and dangerous by the moment. Samuel felt that his perception of his surroundings was beginning to evolve in an unsettling way, as if reality was slowly disintegrating before his eyes. The shadows that once seemed just harmless objects now stretched and distorted, forming figures that moved with predatory slowness, as if they were striving to deceive their senses. Every step he took in the abandoned hut seemed to reflect in waves of distortion, as if the space was warping and creating multiple conflicting layers of reality. The lighting, once dim, now seemed to bend and darken in a way he couldn't understand, causing the walls to expand and contract in a surreal way, almost like an accordion of space. His hands trembled as he tried to focus his vision, but the objects around him seemed to have transformed, like a room that changed shape every moment, becoming something strange and new with each look. The feeling of disorientation deepened to the point of doubting everything he saw and heard. The sound of his own breath seemed more and more distant, as if coming from another dimension, and his eyes began to pick up movements that seemed to move between different planes of existence. Shadows that appeared and disappeared, figures that seemed to deform with the movement of the environment, like a painting that comes to life to deceive his mind. Samuel tried to cling to his rationality, but his mind began to create images of other worlds, of creatures that merged between the tangible and the imaginary, increasingly difficult to distinguish clearly. The ground beneath his feet seemed to bend subtly, as if gravity was being manipulated by an invisible force. The cabin itself seemed to be portraying itself and growing at the same time, in a dance of forms that defied all spatial logic. Still, a part of her mind insisted that it was all an illusion, a reflection of her fear, a distortion caused by loneliness and extreme tiredness. But on the other hand, he had the feeling that something much deeper and more frightening was hidden in that manipulation of perception. Perhaps it was a manifestation of forces that broke free from the confines of the physical world, capable of playing with the minds of intruders and creating a hallucination so convincing that he no longer knew what was true. His senses were at war. At times it seemed that he himself became part of that changing environment, as if he were being absorbed by a reality that was changing faster than his mind could keep up. The walls, the ceiling and the floor seemed to merge into an indistinct mass of forms that advanced and retracted, like a living entity, wanting to drag its consciousness into an abyss. Samuel, lost between what was real and what was imagined, struggled to hold on to his sanity, having the impression that at any moment everything around him would collapse. The feeling of disorientation worsened with each second as the space turned into a distorted version of reality itself, leaving him completely vulnerable in the face of a silence that hid secrets far beyond human understanding. Samuel felt his mind tumultuous, unable to distinguish the fine line between reality and the forces that threatened him. The invisible shadow that haunted him was now more conscious, more aggressive. His footsteps hesitated, sweat running down his forehead as a quiet force surrounded him, exploring his reactions. With each moment, the signs that this was not an illusion increased. The whispers that became obscured screams, the shadows that moved with a predatory intelligence, and the feeling that something fed on his fear, evolving in his presence. For a moment, he wanted to run away, scream, run to the door of the cabin. But another feeling took over, that there was no point in escaping anymore, that it had infiltrated his essence, and confronting him was his only chance of survival. With his heart almost bursting in his chest, Samuel held firmly to the machete, his hands trembling but charged with a resilient determination. His eyes scanned the darkness, searching for the core of that threat. Then, suddenly, the shadow, an entity of indefinite form, rushed forward, trying to swallow your physical form, invading every inch of your visual field. The air seemed to carry a vibration of pure fear, a force that tried to pierce her skin, her soul. The inner battle raged on him, give up or fight with all his might. Samuel screamed, a primal cry of resistance, and charged forward with the machete, cutting through the air toward the shadow that formed before him. For an instant the world seemed to freeze, time frozen in the struggle for its own existence. The creature retreated, like a wounded beast, letting out a scream that seemed to come from the depths of darkness, a mixture of pain and fury. To that moment, he realized something else. The force was not just a definite entity, but a manifestation of a force that adapted itself to his actions. It was an intelligence that studied his resistance, increasing his pressure, trying to destroy what was left of his courage. His muscles ached, his focus was almost non-existent, and the only thing that kept him alive was the desire not to be consumed by infinite dread. The shadow, frightened by his attitude, seemed to lose strength, slowly retreating as his cries became more distant. Samuel felt his body weakened, his strength running out, but he knew that his internal conflict was not yet over. Fear, more intense than ever, screamed inside him, like an anchor that threatened to pull him into the abyss. The battle was not only against that entity. It was against his own limits, against his inner demons, and against the very terror that would not let him escape. In a last-ditch attempt at resistance, he raised his machete once more, staring at the shadow that still writhed in the darkness, with a determination to survive, to understand what that presence wanted, or at least to expel it from his soul. The fight came to a head, and even though he didn't know if he won or lost, Samuel knew that his courage had been put to the test. The silence, now full, only revealed that this had somehow been a confrontation that would change his life forever. A confrontation with his own abyss and his own desperate hope of survival. Samuel stood there, breathing heavily, as the shadow that haunted him slowly retreated into the darkness. For a moment, it seemed as if the threat had been cast out, that the invisible force that had frightened him had dissipated in the eternal night. His muscles trembled with exhaustion, his heart was still beating fast, and a sense of melancholy relief invaded his soul. Even though he knew that nothing was really over, he began to reflect on his actions. The courage to face it, the determination not to give in to fear, and how much his courage could have been a temporary illusion in the face of what he had discovered. The night remained filled with silence, but a subtle tension still hung in the air, like a shadow that refuses to disappear completely. Samuel knew that what he faced was not a mere entity, and that the evil that lurked in the darkness had much more to offer. Secrets that had not yet been revealed, forces that adapted to his attempts at understanding. As he awoke from his internal battle, a cruel doubt remained. Could that threat return, stronger and smarter, at the next opportunity? The abyss still loomed ahead, silent, watching him from afar, waiting for the ideal moment to strike again. And even after the confrontation, the sense of vulnerability remained. A reminder that fear, no matter how confronted, never completely disappears in the darkness. With faltering steps, Samuel turned to the way back, aware that it would have changed his perception forever. The night still carried its shadows, and what lurked in them was perhaps older and more dangerous than he could have imagined. Even after the intense confrontation with the entity, Samuel felt that he had only scratched the surface of a larger mystery. In the silence of the night, as his hands trembled and his mind tried to recompose his shattered sanity, an unsettling understanding began to emerge. What he had faced, or believed he had defeated, was a manifestation of ancient forces, which adapted and evolved in the darkness, as if they were aware of his every action. There were still many secrets buried beneath the forest floor, secrets of a forgotten tradition, linked to ancient legends of skinwalkers and entities that could take any form. Samuel began to realize that what he saw was not a mere creature, but a threat that fed on fear, distrust, doubt. And the more he tried to understand, the more he realized that the true essence of that evil remained hidden under layers of ancient secrets and rituals that few people dared to explore. Every detail he discovered seemed to open a door to a universe of silence, ancestral strength, and indecipherable secrets. Something or someone still had an interest in keeping that secret buried in eternal night, and the force he had faced seemed just a tip of an iceberg that threatened to sink all of his reality. The deeper he delved, the more he realized that this force had control over the shadows, the sounds, and even his perceptions, devouring his hope for a definitive conclusion. The sense that the secrets he had unraveled were only fragments of a vaster and older story tormented him, leaving a vacuum of uncertainty where there had once been a hope of understanding. For even after their confrontation, the mystery remained alive, pulsating in the depths of the forest, waiting for the time to reveal its true face. Samuel knew that some force too great still lurked in the darkness, a force that could not be fully tamed or understood. And as he slowly walked away, his heart heavy and his mind full of doubts, one last vision came into view. a shadow that moved almost imperceptibly, watching him from afar. It was as if the evil essence was just waiting for the right moment to return, stronger, smarter, and darker. The night remained laden with unsolved mysteries, secrets that threatened to awaken again at any moment. And as the forest whispered its secrets in the dim light, Samuel couldn't help but feel that the real abyss was still outside, invisible, waiting, and perhaps the next night what he discovered would be only a small part of a mystery that could never be fully revealed. Ethan Carter was 29 years old and worked as a private investigator in the small town of Grey Ridge, located on the border between Oregon's dense forests and indigenous lands forgotten by time. His routine was marked by small cases, often involving mysterious disappearances, but nothing that compared to the stories that surrounded that remote region. Stories that the residents avoided mentioning, but that everyone knew. Of creatures that camouflage themselves in the shadows, of ancestral forces that hide in the darkness, and of beings that only appear when the night is denser and quieter. It was exactly in this environment full of mystery that Ethan found himself that night, a full moon night that tinged everything with a dim, almost nostalgic light. Their mission was to investigate reports of a series of disappearances in the area, people who disappeared inexplicably, leaving only enigmatic signs on the wet earth. His cottage, an old cabin on the outskirts of town, was on the edge of the forest, where trees rose tall and sloping, forming haunting silhouettes against the starry sky. Ryan, his isolated home, had a tense atmosphere, which seemed to hold dark secrets. The wind whistled through the cracks in the windows, bringing whispers that seemed like indistinct words, or perhaps premonitions. Ethan, accustomed to navigating this suspenseful atmosphere for years, tried to keep a cool head as he reviewed the first clues of the day. But as the clock struck midnight, something out of the ordinary began to happen. Next to his bed, an icy sensation ran down his spine as he heard a strange noise coming from outside, as if someone or something was moving in the woods. For a few moments, silence returned, but soon it was interrupted by a crackling of branches, a sound of heavy footsteps, almost imperceptible in the distance. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and slowly stood up, his breathing becoming heavier. He knew that in those surroundings, within walking distance, there could be something more than a simple, nocturnal animal. Something that did not know the meaning of silence and fear. An ominous feeling invaded his thought, as if the forest itself were breathing ancient air, loaded with secrets that should not be revealed. As he advanced to the door, doubt mixed with fear. Was he himself entering the trap of a force that feeds on the unknown? Or was it just fear and paranoia? But as I looked out the window, the silhouettes of the trees seemed to move subtly, almost as if they were waiting for someone to approach. The threat, silent and almost invisible, began to creep into the surrounding darkness, marking the beginning of a mystery that promised to reveal forces beyond human comprehension. Ethan wasn't sure what he was going to find, but he felt that tonight his steps would push him to the edge between natural and supernatural. And in the dim light, something watched in the shadows, waiting to show its true face. Ethan began to notice little things that didn't make sense in his usual routine. The shadows in the forest seemed denser and more restless than usual, as if they were moving subtly, almost as if they had a life of their own. The branches, previously swaying gently, seemed to protrude irregularly, forming silhouettes that did not fit the ordinary nature of the night. An uncomfortable feeling grew inside him, a kind of presentiment that cut the silence of his heart, reinforcing the idea that it was all more than a joke of his tired mind. As Ethan walked along the dirt road that led to his cabin, his lights shattered in flashes, reflecting shadows that seemed to move independently, as if waiting for him. Perhaps it was just the effect of the fear produced by so many old stories, or the fatigue accumulated after days of investigation. But somehow, he felt that what he observed in the darkness had an intention, a quiet, sinister presence. The sounds also started to get strange. The experienced investigator heard heavy footsteps coming from the forest, but when he turned around, he could see nothing but the dark. A panting breath seemed to echo in his own head, although there was no one around. Then came the subtle sound of branches breaking, a kind of slow movement, almost like an attempt to hide or approach without being noticed. Ethan tried to rationalize everything. They were larger animals that entered the forest, perhaps a deer or even a bear. Or it could just be your imagination, tired by reports of disappearances and old stories. But the whole situation intensified when he noticed unusual marks around his house, oddly shaped footprints with uneven steps and elongated fingers disappearing into the damp mud near the forest. These footprints did not fit into anything he knew. They seemed deformed, almost human, but with an essence that refused to fit into the logic of nature. Worry began to settle in his mind, but also a doubt. Maybe it was just a joke in your head, a psychological effect of being surrounded by legends and scary stories. However, his intuition screamed that something deeper and darker was happening. Every night, the environment seemed to transform before his eyes. Trees that moved slowly, shadows that stretched on purpose, as if trying to hide or prepare for something. Ethan tried to stay calm, trying to rationalize every signal, despite his vulnerable body, his trembling hands, and the fear that grew inside him. Still, a persistent restlessness carried him. The feeling that it was all just a facade, a prelude to something much bigger, something that could not be explained with simple reasoning. The mystery lingered in the air, thicker by the moment, leaving him trapped between the doubt that the real danger was perhaps just beginning to reveal itself in the dim light. Ethan felt his heart race wildly, each beat reverberating like a hammer in the head. Anxiety turned into an overwhelming presence, tightening her chest, making it difficult for her to breathe as her thoughts swirled, desperately trying to find a rational explanation for it all. Every sound in the forest seemed more intense, more threatening. Heavy footsteps moving between the trees, branches breaking under an invisible weight, breaths that seemed to come from all sides, though he saw nothing but darkness. A sense that his limits were being tested washed over him, and the anguish of not understanding the source of what threatened him only increased the feeling of powerlessness. Ethan tried to cling to his rationality, remembering that it might just be his mind playing tricks because of fatigue, stories, or accumulated fear. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, an inner part insisted that something more sinister and unknown was approaching. Something that fed on his fear and had no intention of retreating. His muscles were tense, and his fingers clenched. The handle of the flashlight as an arrow of terror pierced his spine every time a new sound or shadow emerged. With each instant, the threat seemed to grow, becoming more concrete, more palpable, as if it was adjusting, learning its moves, or even changing shape in the darkness itself to intimidate him even more. Ethan began to feel that danger was not a simple creature or natural phenomenon, but a force that adapted to his emotions and perceptions, an entity that seemed to play with his senses for an unknown end. A shadow moved, and for a second his eyes thought he saw an elongated figure, almost like a human silhouette, which disappeared as quickly as it appeared, leaving a feeling of chill down his spine and the certainty that he was being hunted in an invisible expanse. His thoughts, once clear, became a mess of doubts and fears. Impotence overwhelmed him. He had no weapons capable of facing it, no strategies to escape, just a desperate desire to escape that endless nightmare. The moments dragged on slowly, as if time was dilating around him, making every second an eternity. The night, which seemed silent and static, actually hid an invisible threat, an evil force that fed on his fear, growing in the darkness. Ethan felt increasingly vulnerable, a helpless prey in the voracity of that unknown evil. Anxiety consumed his hope, and his mind began to fragment under the weight of uncontrollable fear, while his sense of helplessness dragged him into a spiral of despair. And at that moment, the only thing he was sure of was that the threat, as vague and frightening as it was there, stronger and closer than he could have imagined, and his heart was racing so much that it seemed to want to explode at any moment. Samuel began to realize that the shapes in the dim light were not mere shadows, but something that quietly adjusted to his fear. The trees surrounding his cabin seemed to move slowly, their silhouettes elongating and withering, almost imperceptibly, creating a scenery that felt alive and enigmatic. The sounds also changed. Heavy footsteps, which could once have been those of animals, now seemed more coordinated, almost like a conscious response to his every move. A barely audible whisper began to echo in the woods, a distant voice that seemed to adapt and evolve, molding itself to what Samuel was trying to understand, or fear. He felt that something there, invisible, was watching and adjusting to his reactions. His senses sharpened. Every creaking branch, every movement in the darkness seemed to acquire a new intention, a presence that played with his perception, increasing the sense of a real threat. Even though he tried to rationalize, he could not shake the idea that there were forces there that camouflaged themselves, that adapted to his despair. Like a predator adjusting its approach, the threat seemed to silently evolve around it, deepening its vulnerability. Samuel also noticed that the footprints on the ground were changing shape, distorted and irregular, as if whoever or what made them was regretting his attempt to disguise himself. These marks seemed to express a language of their own, a code of fear that expanded in the mud, leaving a trail of mystery and danger. Everything around him seemed to be constantly changing, as if the forest itself was alive, swallowing his hope, and preparing for a threat that was unaware of his true intentions. The feeling that supernatural forces had infiltrated his reality grew, leaving him powerless in the face of an adversary who adapted faster than his mind could comprehend. Samuel began to doubt what it really was, an entity, an ancient spirit, or a force that fed on fear. His only certainty was that this was not a simple illusion. The threat had an intelligence of its own, an ability to mold itself to his emotions and to infiltrate his perception. With each moment, the forest around him seemed to transform more, its shadows lengthening, its sounds intensifying, and the feeling that something much older and more dangerous was hiding in the dim light increased. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was being tested, like prey playing a cruel game with its invisible predator. And, deep down, one certainty remained. These forces would not fully reveal themselves yet. They would only approach in the darkness, leaving an even deeper and more frightening mystery. Samuel knew that the real threat was not what he could see, but what still lurked in the mist, preparing to strike at the right time. Samuel felt his perception unraveling at every moment. The shadows that had once been mere indistinct forms now seemed to writhe and transform, as if they had a will of their own. The trees around his cabin, which he was sure he knew well, seemed to move slowly, their silhouettes elongating and shortening, almost imperceptibly, like a frightening dance that defies the laws of logic. Each branch, each leaf, seemed to be part of a plot that only he could feel but not understand. The sound of the wind also began to distort, taking on tones that seemed more metallic, almost like muffled screams in a parallel dimension. Samuel tried to focus his mind, to convince himself that it was all an illusion caused by fatigue or fear. But his senses threw something different in his face. His reality was being manipulated, fragmenting before his eyes. The walls of the hut seemed to weaken, as if they were made of an unstable matter that was given to the gears of an invisible machinery. She stretched, retracted. The objects around her seemed less solid, more ethereal. His brain, once steadfast in the search for a rational explanation, was now lost in a web of confusing images and contradictions. Sometimes he would see a face forming on the wall, a face that was not his, or perhaps it was, but with expressions that constantly changed, like a moving illusion. His ears also betrayed his sanity, with whispers and moans that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, even though there was no one there. Samuel tried to lean on the memory that it was just his fear playing with his mind, but a deep and instinctive part insisted that there was something more here, forces that molded themselves to his perception, that manipulated his understanding of reality. Every second, he had the impression that the space around him was spreading and condensing in ways that were not human, as if the universe itself was folding and rebuilding itself in front of him. Her eyes, once confident, began to see details that were not there before, things that seemed to hide in the dim light, just waiting for the moment to truly reveal themselves. And meanwhile, the environment around him seemed to fulfill a kind of ritual of distortion. The trees, the walls, the floor, everything seemed to be alive, breathing with its own rhythm, slowly taking him to the limit between the real and the imagined. Samuel felt completely out of place, like a traveler lost in a dimension that changed shape at every moment, an endless nightmare. His mind was desperately trying to distinguish what was true, what was a hallucination, and what might be a force that fed on his own doubt. Every click, every sound seemed to be part of a larger conspiracy, a manipulation that left him even more confused. In the end, he realized that the boundary between what he believes to be real and everything his fear shows him had become so blurred that, for a moment, he doubted his own existence. Samuel felt the shadow approaching more quickly than he could follow. The invisible presence, which had hitherto been limited to whispers and indistinct shadows, now seemed to take shape. An entity with distorted contours and eyes that reflected the darkness with a menacing intensity. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a summons to the final battle against that which he could not fully comprehend, but which clearly threatened him in a deadly way. The night seemed to contract around him, the space between him and the threat shrinking until it seemed like a single point of despair. Samuel raised his arm with the machete trembling, a force of will rising in the depths of his soul. It was a desperate action, but his only hope of resistance. As the shadow cast itself, he cried out, a primal scream loaded with fear and resistance. His blade collided with an invisible energy mark, a force that ruffled his skin and threw him backwards, as if a figure of pure will antagonized his actions. Even so, Samuel did not back down. His eyes flared with determination as he faced that force that seemed to want to devour him whole. The entity writhed, like water trying to escape from an invisible prison, amplifying Samuel's internal struggle. He felt that his mind was on the verge of collapse, between the panic of being consumed and the courage to resist, not to be subdued. Still, his courage was formed in adversity. With all the strength he had left, he charged at her with blows of hope and despair mingled. A last attempt to break the connection, to break the silence that had swallowed his soul. And for a moment, the universe seemed to sway. The shadows receded, the screams fell silent, and everything was in pure uncertainty. Samuel felt that he had resisted, however slightly, that force which fed his worst fears. The silence that fell after the battle seemed heavier than before, charged with a threat that had not yet been completely driven out. Deep down, he knew that this was not the end. Evil, or that which lurked in the darkness, had learned to adapt, to hide, to keep waiting. His fight had not been just against an entity, but against the very shadow of fear and doubt that would try to haunt him again. His heavy breathing echoed in the quiet night as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. But one thing was certain: the battle had its price. Like a warrior on the brink, Samuel realized that even though he had faced the threat still remained silent in the darkness, ready to return when he least expected it. Thus the intense confrontation turned into a struggle of resistance, reminding him that in the eternal night of mystery and fear, no one is ever truly safe. And as he adjusted himself, what remained was a bitter awareness that the true horror was still hidden, awaiting its next appearance in the shadows. Samuel stood there, breathing heavily, while the shadow that had attacked him slowly receded into the darkness. For a moment, it seemed as if the threat had gone away, that he had managed to resist, at least temporarily. His muscles were tense, his mind still pulsing with the adrenaline of the fight. In the heavy silence of the night, he tried to calm down, but a deep restlessness settled within him. The images of the battle, the silence that had followed, remained vivid, like a bitter reminder that it could all return at any moment. As his thoughts calmed down a little, a quick assessment of his decisions crossed him. The courage to face, the will to resist, the doubt if that was enough. Every move, every blow he took seemed like a desperate attempt to keep his sanity and his life as the mystery deepened around him. The feeling that something older, stronger, was still there, on the threshold of perception, persisted. Samuel realized that the fight was not over. It had only slowed down, leaving a feeling that the real confrontation was yet to come. The environment around him seemed quieter, but his racing heart and his mind full of doubts made it clear that the threat was still watching, hidden in the dim light, waiting for the right moment to return. The night now seemed denser, almost like an invisible web that slowly bound him, reminding him that the old evil never fully disappears. It just hides, waiting for the next moment of vulnerability. Then he took a step back, reflecting on everything he had just been through. How had he gotten there? Why had those forces become so adaptable, so intelligent? The question remained unanswered, further reinforcing the feeling that his combat had been just a spark of something much bigger. His head was spinning with the possibilities that it was a never-ending cycle, or an eternal threat that fed on human fear. Even tired, one certainty remained. That confrontation had changed his perception of the world. Her vulnerability, powerlessness, and fear were still in her soul, like marks of a battle that might never really have ended. The dim light, though quieter now, contained a latent threat, a signature that true horror lurked in darkness, waiting for the next moment of weakness. With a deep sigh, Samuel turned slowly to exchange his final gaze to what remained in the shadows. It was clear that despite everything, the threat still fed on silence and uncertainty, ready to return at the most unexpected hour. And as he walked back inside the hut, the sense that the greatest mystery was yet to come lingered like a shadow to his shadow, a constant reminder that in the battle between light and dark, no one really wins completely, even after the confrontation and the apparent withdrawal of the dark force. Samuel realized that the night carried an even greater weight than it seemed at first glance. There is something deeper, something that he has not yet been able to fully understand. The signs revealed so far were only fragments of a larger mystery, a web of secrets buried deep in the forest and in the forgotten history of their region. He was beginning to realize that what he had faced was not a simple manifestation, but an ancestral force that adapted, that camouflaged itself, that fed on human fear and doubt. With each discovery, more questions arose. Why did that force manifest itself in that place? What ancient secrets were buried in the earth or hidden in the collective memory of those who lived there? And most of all, what would happen if something more powerful awakened in the darkness? This feeling that there was still much to unravel accompanied him like a shadow. The accounts he found in ancient banknotes, nearly illegible symbols, and local legends pointed to a truth that few had dared to explore. A truth that spoke of a cycle of suffering, of entities that disguised themselves in the form of men or animals, waiting for the right moment to get back on their feet. Samuel felt that what he had seen, what he had faced, was only a small tip of the iceberg, a threat that fed on the unknown. The forest, the cryptic objects left forgotten, even the shadows themselves seemed to hold a secret. And the most unsettling thing, he was afraid that all this could happen again, that the force could return stronger, smarter, and more thirsty for his soul. His mind was buzzing with questions. Was there a way to stop it from going further? Could it itself be a piece of an old game which had not yet ended? Or perhaps evil was eternally hiding in the darkness, waiting for the perfect moment to emerge again? In her stillness, a new realization began to emerge. Those secrets were not just old stories, but voices of a past that insisted on surviving, crying out to be revealed, or perhaps to be forgotten forever. And so, as he walked away, a last shadow slowly moved into the forest, a silhouette that seemed to watch him as a silent warning that the real mystery was just beginning. Something deeper, older, and more terrible had not yet been completely revealed, and in the silence of the night she waited, hidden in the dim light, hoping that someone, someday, would dare to unveil her. Because, in the eternity of mystery, the darkest secret is the one that is never fully revealed. So did you like this sinister story? So don't forget to subscribe here to the channel. Activate the bell so you don't miss any spooky news that is coming. Come be part of this community that loves to unravel the scariest mysteries and stay on top of everything firsthand. Let's explore the unknown together and face fear head on. So click there, activate the notifications, and leave your like to strengthen our ride. We are together on this journey.